Hey and welcome to the Arcane Mage guide. Just to take note, this was made during patch 7.2 with some 7.2.5 addition in mind, like Legos, as there aren't any mechanically changes coming to the spec as the making of this video. So just a slight warning if something does change drastically. Alright, so let's get right into it. And the first thing I want to talk about, or better yet mention, is the artifact rates. Just letting you know which best path first to take. As for the rest, I will talk about as I go. So, stats. And to talk about stats, we need to go over how Arcane Mage works, because it's a very different playstyle comparing to Fire or Frost or any other spec in the game, really. The main focus of Arcane is managing your mana and your arcane charges to deal damage. Basically, your two resources. Mana allows you to do your spells, and the charges, which are the total of 4, allows you to do more damage progressively per charge in your main spells like Arcane Blast, Missiles, Barrage and Explosion, plus some others, but also uses more mana. To manage that, you're essentially going to have two phases during your gameplay. The burn phase, where you just go crazy and just spend all of your mana to deal as much damage as possible. Then using spells like Evocation to continue that burn. And then the conserve mana phase, where you have to hold back and do everything you can to still do meaningful damage, but playing in such a way that you don't go out of mana, while waiting for your Evocation to come off cooldown, using spells like Arcane Barrage to dump the charges to go into this phase where you conserve that mana, and create this sort of cycle in the use of your abilities. All these kinds of management we're going to talk about more in depth in the rotation part, so no need to worry. But you could say that you have two sets of rotations that you need to worry about, okay? That said, you might think because of that your most important one would be Mastery, because it increases your mana and its regeneration, plus increases the damage each arcane charge gives you. So your main spells, like I said before, so best stat. Seems logical. And not really. It isn't bad by any means, but isn't the stat that you want to focus exclusively. You want to have some, but you're going to reach a point where it will start losing value. So to define it is hard for me to say, because in general it's very difficult to pinpoint which best stats are for Arcane. The best advice I can give is to sim your stat weights. But what I believe to be a good match is to have your mastery in your 20s, so between 20% to 30%. Higher than that, it starts to lose value, and fast. Just so you can have a good amount of extra mana and regeneration, plus that extra damage it gives to your arcane charges. The stats that seem to benefit you the most overall though are actually crit and then haste. Haste coming close to crit, but crit seems to be a pretty good pick. Even though you want to have a good amount of haste and mastery, as said before, but you also don't want to stack just crit like a Fire Mage. You want to have a somewhat balance between all of these stats, okay? The reason why crit is so good is simple. Since mana is such an integral part of the Arcane Mage and where all of your damage is based upon, critting with your spells, primarily Arcane Blast, is going to favor you more than the other choices. The reason being, it will provide you the most damage per mana spent ratio, meaning more chance to crit will make that big chunk of mana that you spent on that Arcane Blast be far more worth, and you're going to do more damage for the amount of mana that you have over the course of the fight. Makes sense? Mastery increases the mana and the charge damage, but if you have more mana to spend and that flat damage increase on the charges, which will only really benefit you during the burst phase really, while critting with your spells will outdo that extra mana you might have with that higher mastery. So when you put those two together, crit will benefit you more than mastery in the long run. Haste helps you casting things faster, reducing your global cooldowns, which will improve in particular your burst phases, but isn't as beneficial as crit. You don't want to neglect it, but since your damage is based on how much mana you can use, casting spells faster isn't going to really benefit you much in the long run of the fight. As for versatility, in a way it works like mastery, but versatility improves your damage overall as opposed to just being on your charges, so in the future might become an important stat for you. But again, to find the perfect stats for your character, simming it will be the best way to go, okay? Now, talents, and there might be some talents here, especially with the new LEGO ring, that might possibly change the thinking behind your stats, but more on that in a bit. Let's look at your first set of talents, shall we? So, Arcane Familiar gives you a pet-like mana or thingy just above your shoulder, doing minimal damage, and as we covered, more mana allows you to do more damage. But the mana that it offers isn't enough to compete with the other two choices. Plus, it seems to bug out constantly when phasing out of zones or just loading screens. A lot of the times you even forget to put it back when that happens. Annoying more than anything else. Amplification is probably the one you want to go with. It gives you a 12% increase per charge on your Arcane Missiles, and Arcane Missiles is one of your most important abilities along with your Arcane Blast. Each charge increases your ability's damage by 75%, plus your mastery stat. This talent is then increasing it 12% further for each charge. So, pretty good choice. Words of Power has potential, but the extra chance it gives to proc Arcane Missiles isn't really worth it. It's only really useful during your conserve mana phase where you start losing mana, but as it stands I never felt the need to have more Arcane Missiles procs, making it weaker than the latter. Second tier, Mana Shield is going to hurt you more than anything else, at least in PvE. Your choices are mostly going to come down between Shimmer and Slipstream, of which you might want to change around depending on the fight. Shimmer gives 2 stacks of Blink and allows you to blink on cast, so pretty good when casting your Arcane Blasts or even Evocation or even Arcane Missiles to get that on-demand movement, but Splitstream allows you to cast Evocation and Arcane Missiles while actively moving. Both are great and is going to depend on the situation. Most of the time Shimmer will work since it works with any spell, but Slipstream allows you for longer movement bursts. So decide for yourself which one is best for you. Third tier is Rune of Power. No contest here. Mirror's Image is pretty weak on Arcane and Incanter's Flow does not fit well with your rotation and playstyle. However, it can be good if you can't use Rune of Power properly or just can't be arsed, because Rune of Power fits perfectly with your mana burn phase and highly boosts your damage during set phases. Fourth, Supernova can work, isn't too bad, basically an on-demand AoE ability on a 25-second cooldown, but the damage isn't that high unless in high AoE based fights. Even so, the other choices, if used correctly, pull ahead, such as Charged Up. Is interesting. It's on a 40-second cooldown and gives you 4 arcane charges at will, allowing you to bypass that build-up in your opener that we are going to talk about in a bit, and doing some shenanigans for extra arcane barrages in cleaving or even in single target, especially good if you have the Kilt Lego. Again, more on that in a bit. Resonance boosts your arcane barrage by 25% extra damage per target hit, so arcane barrages has 2 uses. It's your cleave ability and your arcane charge dump ability during conserve mana phases. Plus, with the Kilt Lego, it also gives you mana. And it's used for both in single target and multi-target. This talent is going to boost this damage substantially for cleave, but even in single target will be a good choice to take. In fact, even though Charged Up has a more logical sound damage boost, since you can bypass the build-up a lot of the times, it actually pulls ahead in numbers. Not by much, but still slightly ahead on the sims I performed. Even so, I'll leave that choice up to you. Personally, I find our Charged Up more fun to use, however, with the tier 20 set bonus giving your Presence of Mind, one of your cooldowns, also giving you 4 charges, is gonna make Charged Up sort of obsolete, at least in single target and unless you have the Kilt Lego again, but in general something to keep in mind. Fifth tier, it doesn't really matter much, I just use Chrome Shift, giving me a little bit more mobility and CC. Next tier, I'm also gonna give it up to you. Nether Tempest is cool, but the damage was never enough for me to make a choice to take it. Essentially, you have to build up to 4 charges, then you can use it for optimal damage and keep it up throughout the fight, doing some damage in there, but mostly used for AoE. But as I said, I never felt the need to have it. I just felt that I lost a global cooldown on it when I could just do one more Arcane Explosion or Barrage or really any other spell. As for Unstable Magic, can work, it's a completely passive and is just giving you a little extra damage on Arcane Blast, but Erosion seems to be the best choice overall, leaving a debuff on the target per arcane spell hit, stacking up to 8 times. Keeping it up is pretty easy and gives you a solid DPS increase without any RNG and losing global cooldowns as opposed to the other choices. And finally, last tier, Overpowered will be your go-to choice for almost every situation, making your arcane power your most powerful cooldown even more powerful, giving an extra 30% damage and mana reduction on spells, for a total of 60, meaning we'll do more damage and can fit even more arcane blasts during your burst and burn mana phases. As for Arcane Orb, can actually function, working in a similar way to Charged Up. You can also do some shenanigans with it. The damage itself is good, but not that valuable, but it does give you a high chance on Arcane Missile procs, and it gives you an Arcane Charge per hit, meaning you can put in a lot of Arcane Barrages for Cleave and AoE, combining with Charge Up for even more, or Resonance for the extra damage. Also extremely good with the Lego Kilt. However, Overpowered will technically pull ahead in numbers, but in scenarios such as a dungeon, it may favor you. Although with that new Lego that gives you a chance at random to an Arcane Orb to pop up, can make these talents less worth to take even in these situations if you have it, but I'll leave that choice up to you. Temporal Flux isn't that valuable. It will make your Arcane Blast cast faster per charge you have, which is great and you really feel like you're going into this crazy burst mode. But as I said in the beginning of the video, your damage is bound to the mana that you have, so casting faster will be good for bursts as your damage is going to be boosted in this short window of time, but in the end your damage will be the same because the number of Arcane Blasts that you will do will be exactly the same as if without the talents, because again, that is defined by the mana, not speed or haste, as opposed to most other specs or classes in the game. For short windows though, can be extremely good. That said, your new Lego ring is going to give you Temporal Flux for free, meaning that combined with Overpowered that it can also take at the same time, will work amazingly. In theory, because as I said, casting Arcane Blasts faster isn't going to benefit you much in the long run. But if you can fit that talent with Overpowered, casting them faster is going to benefit you much more, because the idea of arcane power, especially with Overpowered, is to cast as much spells as you can in that window. With Temporal Flux, you will be able to fit much more Arcane Blasts as you are casting them faster, and without too much mana issues due to its reduction as well, making your burst so much better. You just need to be more careful when out of arcane power, but you shouldn't have any problems. With that in mind, your thinking in stats might, and I repeat, might shift. Because with this playstyle, having Mastery should become far more valuable and Haste should become far less, since you're really not going to need it. Especially when you also put in the tier 20 set bonus in there, giving a reduction on a Presence of Mind cooldown per Arcane Missile cast. So basically you will get a lot more instant and faster Arcane Blasts, so having Haste not as important. Crit will probably stay the same like Versatility, but Mastery might rise in value since having more mana now will be better for you, if not a must, because it might drain pretty quick. Something to keep in mind when you acquired such items. But as I said before, simming stat weights will be the way to go, always, just to be sure, okay? Okay, let's go over your rotation, and your rotation has a lot of moving parts. Not really because of RNG, there's some on Arcane Missile's procs, but not a lot. It's mostly due to your mana, which is going to depend from character to character, fight to fight, and if you have specific Legos. And I will try to go over all of those things, but keep in mind, a lot of it you're going to have to adapt yourself to each encounter and situation, okay? So as I said before, your DPS is all about managing your mana. Why? Because of your second resource, Arcane Charge, which practically all of your abilities benefit from. Arcane Blast, Arcane Explosion, and Arcane Missiles build up those charges. More charges you have, the more damage you will do. 70% per charge, plus Mastery stat. But it also increases how much mana you will waste. So at 4 charges, Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion are going to hit very hard, but will waste quite a lot of mana. However, is also where most of your damage will come from. So all of that amounts to needing a lot of management and micromanagement to play it properly, to do meaningful damage without ever going out of mana, which is a pretty rookie mistake a lot of people do when playing Arcane. To make it simple, let's go by steps, starting with your opener on single target with the following talents: Amplification, Rune of Power, Resonance, Erosion, and Overpowered. So with this set of talents, the way you want to start is to first build up all of your charges, your arcane charges, so you can start up your mana burn phase. To do that, you want to cast 4 Arcane Blasts, pre-casting your first if possible. You might get some Arcane Missiles procs that you have a chance to activate from any of your spells, but right now you don't care about them. Now, once that is done is when you start activating all of your cooldowns, and the order that you want to do them is to first use your Mark of Aluneth, your artifact ability. It's going to take 6 seconds to explode, giving you some good damage and gives you 20% of your mana back from your trait, practically replenishing the mana that you wasted while building up your charges. Then you want to use your Rune of Power, immediately followed by Arcane Power and a Presence of Mind, plus any other cooldown you might have, like trinkets, pots, and etc. Both Arcane Power and Presence of Mind are out of your global cooldown, so you can click both of them at the same time. Now you always want to pop your Mark of Aluneth together with your Rune of Power, but always casting the Mark first so you don't lose precious Rune of Power uptime. Okay, so now that you have all of your cooldowns active, you want to go crazy on your damage and burn all of your mana while doing as much damage as humanly possible. To do that, you just need to pay attention to 2 things: Arcane Blasts and Arcane Missiles procs. If right now you have 3 stacks of Arcane Missiles from your build-up, that's the first spell you want to use, because if you cast another Arcane Blast now, you might overwrite procs, and you don't want that to happen. When you have 4 arcane charges is when Arcane Missiles are the most powerful, and they never cost mana, which is going to be important later on. If you only have 2 stacks, you can cast an instant Arcane Blast, then after it, if you have 3 stacks, use Arcane Missiles, if not, use the Arcane Blast again. Once Presence of Mind is out of the picture, your thinking shifts once again, because now you want to use Arcane Missiles after an Arcane Blast whenever you are at 2 stacks. So if you have 2 stacks now, you want to cast an Arcane Blast and Arcane Missiles. If you get another proc, repeat the same. If you only have 1 proc of Arcane Missiles, you can just leave it because you have Arcane Power active, and your Arcane Power not only increases your damage but also greatly reduces the mana cost of your spells, meaning you want to prioritize Arcane Blasts, but you also don't want to neglect Arcane Missiles entirely because they are also very important. That is why you do this rotation. So you just want to repeat that until Arcane Power comes to an end. Once it does, you want to pop your second Rune of Power and continue the same. Arcane Blast until 2 procs of Arcane Missiles, or just dump all of the Arcane Missiles. That is going to depend on your situation, since you can use them for movement with Slipstream, if needed. And just keep burning all of that mana. Once you are completely empty of both missile procs and mana, is when you want to use Evocation to get all of that mana back, bringing you to the other phase in your rotation, the Conserve mana phase. But before going into that, there's a different way to open up. If you have charged up, means you can bypass the build-up of charges that you did previously by casting those Arcane Blasts. So you can just start with Mark of Aluneth, then Rune of Power, charged up, Arcane Power and Presence of Mind, and then just following the same rules as before. This way you get right into your main rotation without needing to building it up. Now you'll get some unused mana given by the Mark of Aluneth, since when it detonates you are practically at full, but delaying that spell will only harm you further, so it's better to just use it from the get-go or as a precast. Then there's the other ways that you can use charged up, especially during your conserve mana phase, but more on that in a bit. One such example is when you do your evocation, you can actually use a barrage before, then charged up and evocation. You're going to get that extra spell in there with no harm done. But if you have the Kilt Lego that makes your barrages also give you mana, you might want to use it differently, but I will save that to the end. So now that you are in your conserve mana phase, your evocation is on cooldown, so you need to be careful in the use of said mana, hence why it's called the conserve mana phase. Right now you are at full charges and without missile procs, so what you want to do is cast 1 to 2 Arcane Blasts at full charges. They're gonna cost a lot of mana, so you need to be careful. 2 should be fine, maybe 3. Then if you have any Arcane Missiles procs, use them. Remember that Arcane Missiles cost no mana, so they are extra important in this phase. More procs you get, the more mana you save. And then, once you have none, you use Arcane Barrage to get rid of all of your charges and then build them back up with Arcane Blasts, reach max charges, but then your Mark of Aluneth is coming off cooldown, so you want to make sure to use it, combining it with Rune of Power, like I said before, to get that extra mana, so you can use Arcane Blasts more freely afterwards. Then only after that you want to dump your missiles, taking advantage of the rune as well, and then do 1 or 2 extra Arcane Blasts if you feel comfortable enough. And finally, you want to use the Barrage to dump the charges, usually at the end of the Rune of Power. Then after, just repeat that process, but without the Mark of Aluneth, building up Arcane Blasts to 4 charges, dump any missile procs, and then do the Barrage. That's essentially the gist of it, on how to conserve your mana, just going up and down with your charges. But the idea is to empty all of your mana like the burn phase, but slowly. The point that you want to reach is to be practically empty of mana when your evocation comes off cooldown, so you can burn the mana again like before with Arcane Power and etc. Okay? Now, during that conserve mana phase, you should be constantly thinking on your next move, because sometimes you can fit an extra Arcane Blast or 2, because just getting to the max, dumping the missile procs and the barrage won't be really enough. So you just have to calculate the amount of mana that you have to the evocation cooldown and time how many spells you're going to need to do it correctly. It will take you some time, but once you get used to it, it's rather easy to do. One thing that can also happen at any point is when you're building up your charges with Arcane Blasts, you might get 3 procs of missiles at 3 charges. You still want to do that 4th Arcane Blast, then use them. Using Arcane Missiles without being at 4 charges is something that you want to avoid entirely, even if it means over-proccing, okay? So, what about your cooldown uses during the conserve mana phase? Well, Mark of Aluneth will be almost ready for you to use after your evocation, meaning you can be a little bit more extravagant on your Arcane Blasts, because again, it's gonna give you some mana back. As for your other cooldowns, it's hard to say exactly, because all of them have different timers, so you're going to have to adapt to that, which is going to change from fight to fight. But what I want you to have always in mind is that you want to have a Rune of Power ready to combo with Mark of Aluneth, following the same rules as before, and one ready for Arcane Power. You can use Rune of Power out of those cooldowns, but you just need to keep track of its cooldown to make sure you have one charge ready to be comboed with those other DPS cooldowns. And don't ever use a Rune of Power below 4 charges. If you have a free one, get to the 4 charges first and combo that with the Arcane Missiles, okay? For the presence of mind, again, you have to see for yourself when is the best time to use it. You can save it for Arcane Power or to a Rune of Power or both. Or even just use it when you need the instant cast for movement. There's really no best way to use it. As for your second Arcane Power and your following ones, you want to save it after an evocation comes off cooldown. So, as I said before, when you're slowly going down on your mana in the conserve mana phase, and then you finally empty and your evocation is off cooldown, that's when you know you did it correctly. Then when you are at full mana, you want to use Rune of Power and Arcane Power. You don't really want to combine Mark of Aluneth now because you want to use it to get mana afterwards. If you use it after an evocation, is going to be mostly useless, okay? Then you just repeat the same steps as said before in the burn phase. Spam those Arcane Blasts and then missiles when at 2 stacks, until Arcane Power ends, and then go back to the conserve mana phase. Basically, your rotation is just this cycle of burning mana to then saving up that mana, finding the best ways to use our cooldowns while fitting as much spells as possible until you can use evocation and just repeat that. Now, things to keep in mind. Touch of the Magi is one of your traits, a random debuff that soaks up damage and then explodes for 20% of the damage done during its duration. And in general, you don't care about it. It either appears or it doesn't, it's just out of your control, and focusing on it will just result in a damage loss. The charged up talents, well, besides the easier opener, you can use it mid-fight to get an extra barrage in there. Basically meaning you get to 4 charges, dump missiles, use barrage, then use charged up, another Arcane Blast, and another barrage. Basically, you get more barrages in a short windows of time. In the end, it won't matter much to your DPS and will result about the same as Resonance, although if you're wearing the Kilt Lego will obviously be more valuable for the extra mana it gives you, allowing you to get some extra Arcane Blasts in there, especially during the conserve mana phase, okay? As for Supernova, if you want to use it, you can just fit it in during your conserve mana phase for that extra free damage and chance at Arcane Missiles procs. Make sure to use it at 4 charges, and you can also use it for movement. The same follows for Nether Tempest if you want to use it as well. Now, as for the Lego Ring or Temporal Flux in general, it won't change up your gameplay at all. You just need to be extra careful on your Arcane Blasts and mana since they cast faster. As for other mana-based Legos like the head or the wrists will all come down to the same thing, which is always having this thought process in your mind, that is, how many Arcane Blasts can I cast right now? That's it. That's basically what your gameplay sums up to be. How many spells can I use with the amount of mana I have? So what about the tiers 20 set bonus? Well, it will make your presence of mind grant 4 charges and increases your damage by 10% for 6 seconds. And Arcane Missiles reduces its cooldown by 4 seconds. And what that will amount to? The testing I did, which is subject to change, so take it with a grain of salt, it just means you want to use it whenever it comes off cooldown, and using it in a similar way to charged up, both for the opening and mid-fight. For mid-fight, you can get that extra barrage in there, making the Kilt Lego even more powerful, and you can also bypass the build-up. In general, the cooldown is going to be reduced for almost half of its duration, so saving it to combo with your other cooldowns is going to be less beneficial to you. And since Arcane Missiles reduces its cooldown, you want to use it as fast as possible to get as much uses of it as you can, okay? And that covers your single target rotation. As for AoE, is practically the same. You're simply going to switch to using Arcane Explosion instead of Arcane Blast on more than 2 targets, but everything else stays the same. So basically what you want to start with is building up your charges with Arcane Explosion, which is your most important AoE ability, or using spells like Charged Up or Arcane Orb to get at max quickly, then use explosions 1 or 2 times, depending if you want to sustain AoE or burst, and then barrage. Remember that Arcane Barrage can do a lot of damage, so extremely good for AoE and cleave, but in general is the same cycle rotation as before, burn mana with Arcane Explosion or just conserve by weaving in barrages more frequently. Cooldown uses stay the same, and use Arcane Orb and Charged Up if you have them in between to get some free Arcane Barrages, and make sure to place Mark of Aluneth well for the explosion. And that's really about it. There's really no linear way to do it, it's all going to depend on the situation that you are on, but that's the idea that you need to have going into it. As for Arcane Missiles, you also want to use them in multi-target, but only if you have around 3 mobs. More than that, don't really bother with it and just spam your other abilities. And by doing that, your AoE damage should be pretty good. It's mostly Arcane Explosion spam, which can be quite annoying since it's melee range. And I think that covers it all. For some last notes, Arcane Mage can be tricky to play and very unforgiving to mistakes, but once you get the hang of it, can be quite fun and interesting. But always remember to keep track of your mana and always thinking about how many Arcane Blasts you should use. Only using Arcane Missiles at 4 charges, and then learn to adapt to your cooldowns. And basically, that's the steps you need to take on learning it. As for mobility, you can have quite a lot of it depending on your talents, and will take some practice to take advantage of it. But between Shimmer or Splitstream, Arcane Barrages, good uses of Presence of Mind, and Charged Up or even Supernova, and you shouldn't have any problems with said mobility. Okay? And that was all from me. As always, Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Have fun, guys, and bye bye.